The sirens would come later. They would shatter the October stillness, scatter the ducks from the water, and bring 3 patrol cars screaming into Riverside Park with lights blazing and officers ready for violence. But that was still 45 minutes away. Right now, in the golden quiet of an autumn morning, the only sounds were the gentle lap of water against the shore and the soft rustle of leaves surrendering to the season. The man on the bench had no idea he was being watched. He sat alone near the water's edge. An elderly black man in a faded olive drab field jacket that looked like it had seen decades of wear. His trousers were baggy corduroys, practical rather than fashionable. A simple grey beanie covered his close-cropped silver hair. In his weathered hands, he held a canvas bag filled with cracked corn, tossing small handfuls onto the frost-kissed grass where a congregation of mallards had gathered for their morning meal. To anyone passing by, he looked like exactly what he appeared to be, a retiree enjoying the simple pleasure of feeding birds on a beautiful fall day. Perhaps a grandfather killing time. Perhaps a widower seeking solitude. Perhaps just an old man who had discovered that ducks, unlike people, never disappointed you. 300 yards away, in a patrol car idling near the park entrance, Officer Derek Sloane saw something very different. Sloane was 27 years old with a military-style haircut so precise it looked like it had been applied with a ruler. He had the build of a former high school linebacker, slowly losing the battle against desk work and drive-through meals. But he carried himself like he was still the biggest man in any room. His jaw was set in a permanent expression of suspicious disapproval. His eyes moved constantly, scanning, evaluating, categorizing. When those eyes landed on the old man by the lake, something shifted in Sloane's posture. He leaned forward slightly, his fingers tightening on the steering wheel. The park was in Oakwood Hills, an affluent suburb where the median home price hovered around $2 million. Sloane had internalized a very specific understanding of who belonged in this zip code. Doctors belonged. Lawyers belonged. Investment bankers and tech executives and their immaculately groomed families belonged. An elderly black man in worn-out clothing sitting alone on a bench at 8:30 in the morning? That didn't fit the profile. Sloane's mind immediately began constructing narratives. A vagrant who had wandered in from the city, perhaps. A homeless man looking for a warm spot to sleep. Or worse, a potential burglar scouting the multi-million-dollar properties visible through the trees. At best, a nuisance. At worst, a threat. What Sloane didn't see, couldn't see, because his assumptions had already blinded him, was the truth. He didn't see the man who had spent 38 years in law enforcement, rising from foot patrol in the city's most dangerous district to the highest office in the department. He didn't see the former chief of police who had commanded over 3,000 officers, dismantled corrupt units, testified against dirty cops while knowing it might cost him his life. He didn't see the architect of the state's modern use of force policies, the guest lecturer at the FBI National Academy, the legend whose name was still spoken with reverence in precincts across 3 counties. He saw an old black man who didn't belong. And that was enough. Sloane threw the cruiser into drive, the tires crunching against gravel as he swung toward the lake path. His hand moved unconsciously to check his sidearm, then to the taser on his belt. He didn't call his position into dispatch. He didn't wait for any actual criminal activity to occur. He had already decided how this encounter would go. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that the calm, quiet man tossing corn to the ducks had stared down cartel kingpins and fired corrupt officers without a second thought. That those weathered hands had signed termination papers and arrest warrants, had held the hands of dying officers and the shoulders of grieving widows. One confrontation. One grabbed shoulder, one lie screamed into a radio, and a career built on bullying the powerless was about to collapse in spectacular, public, and utterly satisfying fashion. But first, we need to understand how a decorated police chief ended up feeding birds in a park where nobody knew his name. Marcus Washington had earned his peace the hard way. 68 years old now, with silver threading through what remained of his close-cropped hair and deep lines carved into his dark face by decades of impossible decisions. His body carried the evidence of a career spent in harm's way. 2 bullet scars, one on his left shoulder and one just below his ribs. From an assassination attempt by organized crime figures who had learned too late that Marcus Washington couldn't be bought, threatened, or intimidated. Chronic pain in his lower back from a tackle during a hostage situation in his 40s. Hands that sometimes trembled from old nerve damage, though never when it mattered. For 38 years, Marcus had worn a badge. He started as a foot patrol officer in the Riverside district, the kind of neighborhood where gunshots were as common as birdsong, where a black cop had to prove himself twice over, once to the community that viewed all police with justified suspicion, and once to fellow officers who questioned whether he really belonged. Marcus had walked those neon-lit streets with a target on his back from both directions, and he had survived through a combination of intelligence, integrity, and an absolute refusal to compromise either. The rise had been slow but inexorable. Sergeant by 30, lieutenant by 35, captain of the narcotics division by 40, where he had discovered that the greatest threat to effective policing wasn't the criminals on the street, but the ones wearing badges. He had spent 3 years building an airtight case against a corrupt unit that had been stealing from drug seizures, planting evidence on innocent people, and operating as their own criminal enterprise. When he finally brought them down, he had to testify in open court while knowing that some of those officers had friends who wouldn't hesitate to arrange an accident. Deputy Chief by 45, Chief of Police by 52. For 11 years, Marcus had commanded the Metropolitan Police Department, a force of over 3,000 officers serving a population of nearly 1 million people. He had overhauled training programs, implemented some of the nation's first comprehensive de-escalation requirements, established early intervention programs to identify problem officers before they could do serious harm. He had fired cops when the evidence demanded it, even when the union screamed and the department resisted, because he understood that one bad officer could destroy the community trust that took decades to build. The job had cost him 3 marriages, each one broken against the rocks of missed dinners, cancelled vacations, and the emotional unavailability that came from carrying the weight of a city's safety on his shoulders. His son, Marcus Jr., was 40 now and lived across the country. They spoke twice a year, Christmas and Father's Day, conversations that were polite and hollow and filled with silences that held everything they couldn't say to each other. The job had also saved him. It had given him purpose when purpose was all that kept the darkness at bay. It had surrounded him with people who understood, who had seen the same things he had seen, who carried the same invisible scars. It had allowed him to believe that one man, properly positioned and stubbornly committed, could actually make a difference in a world that often seemed designed to crush that belief. When he retired 5 years ago, the department had given him a ceremony. The mayor had spoken. Old partners had flown in from across the country. There had been a 21-gun salute and a flag folded into a triangle and more handshakes than his aching hands could bear. And then there had been silence. The first year of retirement had been the hardest. Without the structure of command, without the constant flood of decisions and crises and responsibilities, Marcus had found himself adrift. He had tried golf and hated it. He had tried fishing and found it boring. He had tried traveling and discovered that hotel rooms felt emptier than his house. What he had found, unexpectedly, was birds. He had been walking through a small park near his new home in Oakwood Hills, a modest house purchased specifically because no one here knew him. No one here needed anything from him. No one here would look at him and see the chief instead of just Marcus. When he had noticed the ducks on the lake, he had sat down on a bench to watch them, and something in their simple, purposeful movements had quieted the noise in his head. He had come back the next day with a bag of cracked corn, and the day after that, and the day after that. 5 years later, feeding the ducks had become his morning ritual. He knew the individual birds now, had given them names based on their personalities. Reynolds, the aggressive male who always pushed to the front. Patterson, the cautious hen who hung back until the crowd thinned. Jenkins, the young drake with the damaged wing who had survived against all odds. This was his peace, this quiet bench by the quiet water, the simple act of caring for creatures who expected nothing from him but corn. The ghosts of his career, the faces of fallen officers, the victims he couldn't save, the compromises that still kept him awake some nights, they left him alone here. Or they had, until today. Marcus heard the cruiser before he saw it. 38 years of law enforcement had given him an unbreakable sixth sense for the sound of an approaching uniform, the particular rumble of a Crown Vic engine, the crunch of tires on gravel, the subtle shift in atmospheric pressure that preceded authority. He didn't turn around. He simply lowered his hand into the canvas bag, pulled out another handful of corn, and tossed it toward the water's edge. He already knew what was coming. He had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize the preliminary movements of a pretextual stop, the cruiser positioning itself at an angle, the engine idling just long enough for the officer to run plates that didn't exist because Marcus had walked here, the subtle build-up to a confrontation that had been decided upon before any actual evidence of wrongdoing existed. Marcus sighed, a sound that came from somewhere deep and tired. He was 68 years old. He had survived assassination attempts, political attacks, and the grinding bureaucratic warfare of commanding a major police department. He had thought he was done fighting, but some fights, it seemed, found you whether you were looking for them or not. Derek Sloane had wanted to be a cop since he was 12 years old, not because of any noble impulse towards service, not because of a family tradition or a calling to protect the innocent. Derek Sloane had wanted to be a cop because he had been small for his age, picked on by bigger kids, and he had fantasized about the day when he would have a gun and a badge and the legal authority to make people do what he said. The fantasy had sustained him through high school, where he had finally grown into his body but never grew out of the chip on his shoulder. It had carried him through the police academy, where he had excelled at the physical training but struggled with anything requiring nuance, empathy, or the ability to see situations from perspectives other than his own. And it had followed him onto the streets of his first department, where his supervisors had quickly learned that Derek Sloane was what they called a hard charger, department slang for an officer who treated every interaction as a dominance contest and every citizen as a potential enemy. In 6 years of service, Sloane had accumulated 5 excessive force complaints, 5 separate incidents where citizens had formally alleged that Officer Sloane had used more force than necessary, had escalated situations that could have been resolved peacefully, had treated them with a contempt and aggression for no apparent reason other than the color of their skin or the neighborhood where they lived. All 5 complaints had been dismissed. This was not because Sloane was innocent. In 3 of the 5 cases, there was significant evidence supporting the allegations. Witness statements, minor injuries documented at hospitals. Officers who had quietly expressed discomfort with their colleagues' methods. But the complaints had been investigated by internal affairs units that were understaffed, underfunded, and institutionally resistant to finding fault with their own. They had been reviewed by supervisors who didn't want the paperwork headaches of sustained findings. They had been processed through systems designed, whether intentionally or not, to protect officers rather than the citizens they served. The pattern was clear to anyone who cared to look. Derek Sloane targeted minorities. His stops, his searches, his use of force. All of it skewed dramatically toward black and Latino citizens. A 17-year-old black teenager held face down on hot asphalt for 12 minutes during a suspicious person call that turned up nothing. A Latino business owner whose car was illegally searched in front of his children because Sloane claimed to smell marijuana that no one else could detect. An elderly black woman ordered out of her own vehicle at gunpoint because she matched the description of a robbery suspect. A description that apparently consisted of nothing more than black female. Each complaint followed the same pattern. Each was dismissed for the same reasons. And each dismissal taught Sloane the same lesson. He could do whatever he wanted, to whoever he wanted, and the system would protect him. His transfer to Oakwood Hills 6 months ago had not been voluntary, though his personnel file didn't reflect that. His previous department, after the 5th complaint and the beginning of unwanted media attention, had made it clear that Sloane could either accept a lateral transfer to a quieter jurisdiction or face a formal review process that might not go his way. Sloane had chosen the path of least resistance, telling himself that Oakwood Hills was actually a promotion. Fewer calls, higher property values, better class of citizen. What he had found instead was boredom. Oakwood Hills was too quiet. The calls that came in were noise complaints about landscaping crews, disputes over fence lines, the occasional welfare check on an elderly resident. There was no action, no excitement, no opportunities to assert the authority that Sloane craved like a drug, so he had started making his own opportunities. He cruised the affluent neighborhoods looking for people who didn't fit. Contractors who drove work vans. Delivery drivers who lingered too long. Housekeepers walking to bus stops. Anyone who, in Sloane's carefully cultivated judgment, didn't belong in a zip code where belonging was apparently determined by skin color and vehicle value. His new supervisor, Sergeant William Collins, had warned him twice about his approach to community relations. Collins was old school, cautious, the kind of cop who had survived 2 decades by not making waves. He had told Sloane that Oakwood Hills wasn't like the city, that the residents here had lawyers and connections and weren't afraid to use them, that a smart officer kept his head down and his incidents minimal. Sloane had smiled and nodded and interpreted the warnings as weakness. Old-timers like Collins didn't understand how the job really worked. They had gotten soft, complacent, more concerned with their pensions than with maintaining order. Sloane knew better. Sloane understood that authority only meant something if you used it. That respect only came from fear, that the badge was power and power existed to be exercised. Now, watching the old man on the bench, Sloane felt the familiar electric anticipation that preceded a stop. Here was someone who clearly didn't belong. The worn clothing, the solitary bench sitting, the absence of any visible vehicle. Everything screamed vagrant, transient, potential threat. The fact that the man was black only confirmed what Sloane's instincts already told him. He pulled the cruiser to the curb, threw it into park with a heavy metallic clunk. The sound echoed across the calm lake, and Sloane felt a surge of satisfaction as the ducks scattered from the water's edge. Good. Let the old man know that peace and quiet ended when the law arrived. He stepped out into the cold morning air, immediately hooking his thumbs behind his heavy leather duty belt. It was a pose he had practiced in the mirror, a stance designed to convey dominance and authority. His hand drifted to the butt of his sidearm, not because he expected to need it, but because the gesture sent a message. The old man didn't turn around. That was the first sign that something was different about this encounter. Usually when Sloane approached with this energy, people reacted. They tensed, they turned, they started explaining themselves before he even asked a question. The instant submission was what he craved. The visible evidence that his authority was recognized and feared. This man just sat there, tossing corn to birds that had already fled. Sloane's jaw tightened. Already, before a single word had been exchanged, he felt the familiar heat of irritation building in his chest. This was going to be one of those encounters. One of those situations where someone thought they were too smart, too important, too dignified to show proper respect to a police officer. Derek Sloane was going to enjoy teaching him otherwise. Marcus felt the officer's footsteps approaching across the grass. Heavy, deliberate, the stride of a man who wanted his presence announced. He didn't need to turn around to read the situation. 38 years of experience painted the picture clearly. Young cop, aggressive posture, looking for a confrontation. He kept his hands visible, moving slowly as he reached into the canvas bag for another handful of corn. He tossed it toward the lake where the ducks, now gathered at a safe distance near the shore, watched the proceedings with avian wariness. A woman's voice called out from somewhere behind him, and Marcus felt a small measure of relief at the sound. "Morning, Marcus," Brisk one today, isn't it? He turned his head slightly to see Dorothy Pemberton, 73 years old with steel grey hair, perfectly styled, and a golden retriever named Churchill padding alongside her on the walking path. Dorothy was a retired school principal who had lived in Oakwood Hills for 30 years. She and Marcus had developed an easy acquaintance over his 5 years of morning visits. Nothing deep, just the comfortable familiarity of neighbors who respected each other's routines. "Morning, Dorothy," Marcus replied, tipping his head in greeting. "Keep that sweater tight. Winter's creeping in." Dorothy smiled, but her eyes had moved past Marcus to the officer, now standing perhaps 30 feet away. Her expression shifted, a flicker of concern crossing her features. Something about the situation, the aggressive stance of the young cop, the too casual way Marcus was ignoring him, registered as wrong. "Everything all right here?" she asked, her voice carrying just enough to reach the officer's ears. "Just feeding the birds," Marcus said calmly. "Nothing to worry about." But Dorothy didn't move on. She stopped on the path, one hand absently scratching Churchill's ears, her eyes moving between Marcus and the approaching officer. After a lifetime of managing difficult children and difficult parents and the occasional difficult colleague, Dorothy Pemberton had developed finely tuned instincts for trouble. Those instincts were screaming now. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, holding it casually at her side. Not recording yet. Not quite, but ready. Marcus noticed the movement and felt a flicker of grim appreciation. Witnesses, documentation, the tools that separated a he-said-she-said situation from an indisputable record. The officer was close now. Marcus could hear his breathing, slightly elevated, could smell the cheap aftershave and the coffee on his breath. He kept his own breathing steady, his movements deliberate and calm. He had been in this position before, on both sides of it. He knew how quickly things could escalate, how a sudden movement or a sharp word could transform a tense encounter into a violent one. He also knew that as a black man in America, the burden of de-escalation would fall entirely on his shoulders. The officer could scream, threaten, even put hands on him, and the system would find ways to justify it. But if Marcus so much as raised his voice or pulled his arm away too quickly, he would become the aggressor in the official narrative. The mathematics of this moment were brutally simple. Marcus had spent his career trying to change those mathematics, trying to build a department where officers understood that their authority came with responsibility, that the badge was a symbol of service rather than dominance. He had implemented training programs and early warning systems and accountability measures, and yet here he was, 68 years old and retired, facing the exact same threat that his reforms had been designed to prevent. Some lessons, it seemed, never took. "Hey, you there!" The officer's voice cut across the morning quiet, sharp and loud and dripping with unearned authority. Marcus recognized the tone immediately. It was the voice of the man who had decided how this encounter would go before it even started. He turned slowly, making sure his hands remained visible on his lap, and looked at the young officer for the first time. What he saw confirmed everything his instincts had already told him: the rigid posture, the hand hovering near the sidearm, the jaw set in predetermined hostility. The eyes that looked at Marcus and saw not a person but a category, a type, a threat to be neutralized. Marcus had seen this look 1,000 times during his career. He had seen it in the officers he'd fired and the ones he'd tried to rehabilitate. He had seen it in body cam footage reviewed after shootings that didn't have to happen. He had seen it in the mirror once, during a dark period early in his career before a mentor had pulled him back from the edge. This officer had made up his mind. "Good morning, officer," Marcus said, keeping his voice low and even. "Can I help you with something?" The words were carefully chosen. Polite but not submissive. Cooperative but not pleading. The tone of a man who knew his rights and intended to stand on them. The officer stopped perhaps 6 feet away, close enough to loom but far enough to draw if needed. His nameplate read Sloane. His badge number was 4847. Marcus filed both details away automatically. Old habits of a man who had spent decades documenting encounters. "What exactly do you think you're doing here?" Sloane demanded. The question hung in the cold morning air, and Marcus took a moment before responding. He had learned long ago that silence could be a tool, a way to slow the tempo of an encounter, to force the other party to reveal their intentions more fully. "Feeding the birds," he said finally, gesturing with a calloused hand toward the scattered flock now watching from the safety of the water. Though they seemed to have taken offense to your arrival, it was a mild observation, almost gentle. But Sloane's reaction was immediate and telling. His face darkened, a flush of color spreading up from his collar. He hadn't expected wit. He had expected fear. Stammering, the immediate submission that his badge usually commanded from people who looked like Marcus. "I can see what you're doing," Sloane sneered, his eyes moving over Marcus's worn clothing with open, undisguised contempt. The assessment was obvious. The faded jacket, the baggy trousers, the simple beanie. Nothing that indicated money, nothing that indicated status, nothing that would make this man a problem to push around. "This park is for residents only," Sloane continued, his voice taking on the lecturing tone of a man explaining something to a child. We don't want people coming in from out of town, loitering around, dumping trash all over the grass. Marcus felt the familiar sensation of being erased, of having his entire history, his entire identity, reduced to a single visual assessment made by someone who had already decided what he was. To this young officer, Marcus wasn't a man who had spent 4 decades in service, who had commanded thousands of officers, who had literally written the policies that governed this department's use of force. He was simply a black man in worn clothing who didn't belong. It was a feeling Marcus had experienced countless times throughout his life, both before and during his career. The assumption of guilt, the presumption of unworthiness, the casual cruelty of being seen not as an individual but as a type. "It's a public park," Marcus said, keeping his voice calm and measured, "paid for by county taxes, open to all citizens. Furthermore, a handful of cracked corn isn't trash. It's food for wildlife." He watched Sloane's face carefully as he spoke, noting the way the officer's jaw tightened at being corrected. There it was, the fragile ego that couldn't tolerate contradiction, the insecurity that masqueraded as authority. Marcus had seen it in bad cops throughout his career, had learned to recognize it as the warning sign it was. "I don't care what you think it is, old man." Sloane stepped closer, deliberately invading Marcus's personal space. "You're littering. You're loitering. Now pack up your garbage and move along before I write you a citation." He paused. "Or worse. Or worse." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Marcus had heard it 1,000 times in 1,000 different forms. The implied violence that lurked beneath the surface of too many police encounters. The suggestion that cooperation was not really optional, that resistance would be met with force, that the badge granted the authority to do whatever the wearer wanted. Or worse? Marcus raised a single graying eyebrow, his expression remaining placid. "On what legal grounds are you ordering me to leave a public space? I'm committing no crime, nor am I suspected of committing one." On the path behind them, Dorothy Pemberton had raised her phone. The small red light near the camera lens indicated that she was recording. Sloane was too focused on Marcus to notice, too consumed by the mounting frustration of an encounter that wasn't going according to his expectations. Marcus noticed, though. He filed it away, grateful for the witness, aware that documentation might be the only thing standing between him and a far worse outcome. Sloane's response to being questioned was immediate and predictable. His hand moved from his sidearm to his belt, a subtle repositioning that nonetheless carried the weight of threat. His voice dropped into what he probably imagined was an intimidating growl. "Listen to me very carefully," he said, leaning in until Marcus could smell the coffee on his breath. "I don't need to explain the law to you. I am the law out here. Now give me your ID. Right now." The demand hung in the air between them. Marcus knew his rights. More than that, he had spent years teaching other officers about those rights, about the constitutional limitations on police power, about the difference between lawful orders and unlawful demands. Under Terry versus Ohio and the statutes of this state, an officer could not compel a citizen to produce identification without reasonable, articulable suspicion of criminal activity. Feeding ducks in a public park met no such threshold. He could refuse. He had the legal right to refuse. But Marcus also knew the brutal mathematics that applied to black men in encounters with police. The law said one thing, reality often said another. Officers who didn't get the compliance they demanded had a way of finding other reasons to escalate, resisting arrest for an arrest that shouldn't have happened, obstruction of an investigation that shouldn't have been opened, assault on an officer who had initiated the violence. Marcus had reviewed the body camera footage of too many such encounters. He had attended the funerals of too many innocent people who had died with their legal rights theoretically intact. Still, he was not going to surrender his dignity to satisfy this young man's ego. "Under Terry versus Ohio and the statutes of the state," Marcus said, his voice carrying the clear, unhurried cadence of a man who had spent years lecturing young cadets at the police academy. "You cannot compel me to identify myself unless you have reasonable, articulable suspicion that I am committing, have committed, or am about to commit a crime. Feeding ducks does not meet that threshold." He watched the words land like physical blows. Sloane froze for a fraction of a second, his eyes widening slightly. He had not expected this. He had expected a homeless vagrant, an uneducated drifter, someone who would crumble at the first display of authority. Instead, he had found a man who quoted Supreme Court case law with the casual precision of a lawyer. But Sloane's arrogance was stronger than his surprise. Marcus could see it happening in real time, the momentary hesitation swallowed by the familiar rage, the ego refusing to acknowledge that it might have made a mistake. "You think you're some kind of lawyer?" Sloane spat. "You want to get smart with me?" "I want to be left in peace to feed the birds," Marcus replied calmly. "I also want to avoid an encounter that ends badly for one of us. I suggest you return to your vehicle and find an actual crime to investigate." The suggestion, however calmly delivered, was the wrong thing to say. Marcus knew it even as the words left his mouth. But he was tired of deferring, tired of performing submission to protect fragile egos, tired of being treated like a suspect in the crime of existing while black. Sloane's face contorted with rage. The veins in his neck stood out against his collar. His breathing became audibly heavier. "I told you you're littering," he snarled. "That's a municipal code violation. Now hand over your ID right now, or I am taking you in for obstruction of justice and resisting arrest. I am doing neither of those things, Marcus said firmly. Obstruction requires that I interfere with an official investigation. There is no investigation here. Resisting arrest requires that I be under lawful arrest. You have no grounds to arrest me. He paused. And if you arrest me for sitting on a bench, you will be making a false arrest, which violates my civil rights under Title 18, Section 242. He met Sloane's eyes directly. I strongly suggest you step back, get back in your vehicle, and find a real crime to stop. The correction landed on Sloane like a slap across the face. For a moment, he simply stood there, his mouth slightly open, his mind clearly struggling to process what had just happened. He had approached this encounter expecting dominance, submission, the gratifying exercise of authority over someone who couldn't fight back. Instead, he had found himself being lectured on constitutional law by a man he had assumed was homeless. The cognitive dissonance was too much for his fragile ego to bear. That's it, Sloane said, his voice dropping to something low and dangerous. You're done. He moved without warning, his heavy hand clamping down viciously on Marcus's left shoulder. His fingers dug into the fabric of the old field jacket, gripping hard, preparing to physically yank the elderly man to his feet. It was assault, pure and simple, under the law. An officer could use reasonable force to effect a lawful arrest or to protect himself or others from imminent harm. But there was no lawful arrest here. No imminent harm. There was simply a young man with a badge who was accustomed to using physical force to get what he wanted. Marcus didn't resist. He knew better than to give a rogue cop an excuse to escalate further, to claim that the suspect had fought back, to justify whatever violence followed. 38 years of experience had taught him that physical resistance, however justified, could turn a brutal encounter into a fatal one. But something else shifted in that moment. The gentle bird feeder vanished. Marcus's posture changed subtly, his spine straightening, his shoulders squaring, his eyes, which had been calm and slightly tired, suddenly hardened into something else entirely. The warmth drained from his face, replaced by an expression that Sloane had never seen before, but instinctively recognized as dangerous. It was the look of command, not the performative aggression of a young officer trying to intimidate, not the bluster of authority asserted through volume and threat. This was something deeper, more fundamental. The absolute, unshakable confidence of a man who had spent decades giving orders that other men followed without question. Marcus turned his head slowly, locking eyes with Sloane. "Take your hand off me, son." The volume wasn't loud. If anything, Marcus's voice had dropped, becoming quieter even as it gained weight. But the authority in those words was terrifying. They carried the immovable force of a judge's gavel, the crushing weight of consequences that could not be avoided. "You touch me again," Marcus paused, "and you will end your career today." Sloane's hand released involuntarily. He stepped back, suddenly uncertain, his heart hammering against his ribs. Something was wrong here. Something didn't fit his expectations. Homeless vagrants didn't speak like this. Homeless vagrants didn't look at him like that. Homeless vagrants cowered and pleaded and submitted. This man looked at Sloane like he was already writing his termination letter. Behind them, Dorothy Pemberton had moved closer, her phone still recording. Other morning visitors to the park had paused on the walking paths. Drawn by the confrontation, a man walking his dog, a young mother with a stroller, a jogger who had slowed to watch, witnesses, cameras, the dynamics of the situation shifting in ways that Sloane's limited understanding couldn't fully process. But his ego wouldn't let him back down. His pride wouldn't allow him to simply return to his cruiser and drive away. He had made assertions of authority that would look foolish if he retreated now. He needed to win. He needed to show this old man and himself that the badge still meant something. His hand moved to his shoulder radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4 Bravo." Sloane's voice was noticeably strained as he keyed the microphone, the adrenaline making his words come faster than they should. He didn't take his eyes off Marcus, who remained seated on the bench with his hands clearly visible on his lap. A brief crackle of static, then the calm voice of the dispatcher. "Go ahead, 4 Bravo. I need immediate backup at Riverside Park, south entrance by the lake." Sloane was already constructing the narrative, already building the justification for whatever came next. "I have a non-compliant, aggressive male, refusing lawful orders, physically resisting, refusing to ID. Step it up." Marcus watched him, his expression shifting from command to something closer to profound disappointment. He lied, Marcus thought. He just lied on an open radio channel. Non-compliant. Marcus had calmly explained his legal rights. Aggressive. Marcus hadn't raised his voice or made any threatening movements. Physically resisting. Marcus had remained seated with his hands visible throughout the encounter. Each word was a fabrication, a seed planted to shape the narrative before backup arrived. When those other officers came screaming into the park, they would come expecting a violent confrontation. They would come with adrenaline pumping and hands-on weapons, and the assumption that force might be necessary. Marcus knew the psychology of police work better than almost anyone alive. He knew that officers who arrived as backup to a resisting call were psychologically primed for violence. He knew that the next few minutes could determine whether he lived or died. "Copy that, 4 Bravo, the dispatcher replied, a note of urgency entering her voice. "Backup is en route. Can you provide a description of the suspect? Sloane's eyes never left Marcus. His hand abandoned his sidearm, moving instead to hover over his bright yellow taser. Black male, late 60s, wearing a green military-style jacket and a grey hat. He paused, then added, "Suspect is highly hostile. Advise responding units to use extreme caution." Highly hostile. Marcus felt the weight of those words settling onto his shoulders. Highly hostile meant that officers would approach with weapons drawn. Highly hostile meant that any sudden movement, any attempt to reach for his phone or his wallet could be interpreted as a threat. Highly hostile meant that his life was now balanced on a knife's edge. He had seen this exact scenario play out too many times during his career. Good people, innocent people, dead in seconds, because an officer's false report had primed his colleagues for violence that wasn't necessary. "You just crossed a line you cannot uncross, officer," Marcus said softly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "You just lied on an open radio channel. You have escalated a peaceful encounter entirely because of your own prejudice and your own fragile ego." "Shut your mouth," Sloane yelled, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and fear he didn't fully understand. He drew his taser. The red laser sight danced across Marcus's chest, a small dot of light that held the threat of 50,000 volts. "Hands where I can see them!" Sloane screamed. "Put your hands on your head right now!" Marcus complied slowly. Deliberately, he raised his hands with exaggerated care, lacing his fingers together, resting them gently on top of his grey beanie. Every movement telegraphed. Every gesture designed to give no excuse for violence. "My hands are visible," he said calmly. "I'm complying with your physical demands under duress." He paused as the first distant wail of approaching sirens reached his ears, echoing off the surface of the lake. "But you should know," he continued, "when your shift supervisor arrives, you are going to need a very, very good lawyer." Sloane let out a harsh, nervous laugh. "My supervisor is Sergeant Collins," he said, trying to project confidence he no longer felt. "He's a good cop, and he's going to help me throw you in a holding cell where you belong." Marcus said nothing. But something shifted in his expression. A flicker of something that might have been recognition, might have been grim amusement. The name Collins meant something to him, meant something very specific. The sirens grew louder, and Derek Sloane, completely unaware of the catastrophe bearing down on him, stood with his taser trained on the most dangerous man he had ever encountered. The mathematics of this moment were brutally simple, and Marcus understood them with the clarity of a man who had spent decades on both sides of such calculations. 3 patrol cars were screaming toward this location. The officers inside those vehicles had received a radio call describing a non-compliant, aggressive, highly hostile suspect. They would arrive with adrenaline flooding their systems. Their training kicked into high gear, their hands positioned near their weapons. They would be looking for a threat, and they would find a 68-year-old black man sitting on a park bench. Marcus had reviewed the body camera footage of too many similar encounters. He had testified in cases where the gap between the radio description and the reality on the ground had proven fatal. He had written letters of condolence to families of officers and civilians alike, all because of situations that escalated beyond any rational justification. He kept his hands perfectly still on top of his head. He kept his breathing steady and controlled. He made no movements that could be interpreted as reaching, resisting, or threatening, but he also wasn't going to simply wait passively for whatever came next. "Officer Sloane," Marcus said, his voice carrying just enough to reach the body camera on the young officer's chest. "For the record, I want to state clearly that I have not resisted any lawful order. I have not been aggressive or hostile. I have not committed any crime. I am sitting peacefully in a public park feeding ducks." "I said, shut up!" Sloane's voice cracked, the taser wobbling slightly in his increasingly unsteady grip. "I am also stating for the record," Marcus continued, as if Sloane hadn't spoken, "that you have made multiple false statements over your radio, that you have demanded identification without reasonable articulable suspicion, that you have physically grabbed me without justification, and that you are currently threatening me with a weapon despite my complete compliance." The words were not for Sloane. They were for the camera, for the recording that would be reviewed later, for the documentation that could make the difference between justice and tragedy. "These statements are being made while I am in fear for my life," Marcus added. "I am an elderly man, unarmed, sitting with my hands on my head, and I am being threatened with a taser by an officer who has already demonstrated his willingness to lie and escalate." Sloane's face had gone pale. Something in the calm, methodical documentation was worse than any resistance he had expected. This wasn't how suspects behaved. This wasn't how homeless vagrants responded to police authority. This was how someone responded who knew exactly what they were doing. Someone who understood the evidentiary value of body camera footage. Someone who was building a case in real time. For the first time since the encounter began, a tendril of genuine fear wrapped itself around Sloane's chest. Who was this man? The sirens were close now, close enough that the sound bounced off the lake's surface, creating an eerie echo that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Marcus could see the red and blue lights flickering through the trees near the park entrance. His pulse, despite his outward calm, had accelerated. He was not immune to fear. He had simply learned to set it aside, to think clearly despite its presence, to do what needed to be done while the animal part of his brain screamed for flight. He knew exactly how dangerous the next few minutes would be. Officers arriving to a hostile suspect call went through a predictable psychological transformation during the drive. Their training kicked in. Their bodies flooded with adrenaline. They mentally prepared for confrontation, for resistance, for the possibility that they might need to use force. By the time they arrived on scene, they were primed for violence in a way that no amount of reality could immediately undo. If Marcus moved too quickly, he could be shot. If he tried to explain, his explanations would be filtered through the lens of the false report. If he reached for anything, his phone, his wallet, anything at all, that movement could be interpreted as reaching for a weapon. Dorothy Pemberton, still recording on the path behind them, had realized what was happening. Her face had gone pale, her free hand covering her mouth. She had lived in this country long enough to know what could happen to black men in situations like this. She had seen the news coverage, the protests, the names that became hashtags. She also knew that Marcus was her neighbor, a quiet man who had never been anything but polite, a man who spent his mornings feeding ducks and chatting about the weather. "This isn't right," she called out, her voice trembling. "He hasn't done anything wrong." "Ma'am, step back," Sloane barked, his attention divided now between Marcus and the gathering witnesses. "This is a police matter." "What police matter? He was feeding birds. Step back now or you'll be detained for interference." Marcus caught Dorothy's eye and gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "Don't intervene. Don't give them another target. Just keep recording." Dorothy understood. She stepped back onto the path but kept her phone raised, kept the camera pointed at the scene. The first patrol car burst through the park entrance, tires screaming as it jumped the curb and tore across the grass. A second followed immediately behind, then a third. They converged on the bench like predators surrounding prey. The officers inside already reaching for door handles, already preparing to engage. Marcus kept his hands on his head. This was it, the moment that would determine everything. Car doors flew open simultaneously. 4 officers poured out of the vehicles, moving with the aggressive tactical precision they had been trained for. Their hands hovered over holsters. Their eyes scanned for the threat described in the radio call, the non-compliant, aggressive, highly hostile suspect who had been resisting a fellow officer. What they found was an old man sitting on a park bench with his hands laced on top of his head, and a young officer standing 10 feet away with a taser drawn and shaking hands. The disconnect between the description and the reality was jarring, but it didn't immediately change the officers' behavior. They had been primed for a confrontation, and that priming didn't just evaporate. They formed a loose semicircle around the bench, hands still near weapons, bodies still tense with anticipation. Sloane felt a surge of renewed confidence at the arrival of his colleagues, the backup he had called for, the support he needed to prove that he had been right all along. "Keep your hands right where they are," he barked at Marcus, playing to his audience now. He turned his head slightly toward the lead officer, who had just stepped out of the first car, a heavy-set man in his 40s with the stripes of a sergeant on his sleeves. Sergeant Collins, suspect is non-compliant, refused to ID, and took an aggressive posture. "I'm taking him into custody." Sergeant William Collins was a 20-year veteran of the Oakwood Hills Police Department. Unlike Sloane, Collins had survived 2 decades on the force by reading situations accurately and keeping his head when others lost theirs. He had learned through hard experience that the truth of an encounter rarely matched the first excited description provided over the radio. Now, as he stepped across the frost-kissed grass toward the bench, his trained eyes moved rapidly across the scene. He took in the canvas bag of birdseed lying on the ground. He took in the scattered corn and the ducks watching nervously from the lake. He took in the elderly man sitting with perfect stillness, his hands visible and unthreatening, and then his eyes moved to the man's face. Collins's steps slowed. There was something familiar about that face. The shape of it, the bearing, the way the man held himself even while sitting with his hands on his head. The complete absence of the fear or panic that Collins would have expected from a genuine suspect. "Lower your weapon, Sloane," Collins commanded, his voice carrying a new note of uncertainty. Sloane blinked. "Sarge, he's been resisting." "I said lower the damn taser, officer." Collins's voice had sharpened into something that left no room for argument. "Now!" Reluctantly, Sloane dropped his arm. Though he kept the taser unholstered, Collins continued forward, his eyes still locked on the seated man. With each step, the sense of recognition grew stronger. There was something about those eyes, dark, intelligent, absolutely unafraid. Collins had seen those eyes before, years ago, in a different context entirely. He was 3 feet from the bench when it hit him. The recognition slammed into Collins like a physical force, draining all the color from his face in a single heartbeat. His step faltered, his jaw actually dropped open. No, it couldn't be, but it was. The face had aged, of course. There was more silver in the hair, more lines carved into the dark skin. But the bearing was unmistakable. The eyes were unmistakable. The quiet, commanding presence was unmistakable. Collins had seen this man on television countless times, had attended his departmental briefings, had watched him stand before crowds of officers and speak with a moral authority that left no room for doubt or disagreement. He had served briefly under this man's command. 15 years ago, when Collins was a rookie patrolman in the Metropolitan Department, Marcus Washington had been his commanding officer. "Oh my God," Collins whispered. "Stand down!" Collins's voice boomed across the park with an authority that cut through the tension like a blade. He spun to face the other officers, his eyes wild with an emotion that hovered somewhere between horror and panic. "Everyone stand down! Holster your weapons and step back to your vehicles! Do it now!" The other officers exchanged bewildered glances. The older sergeant, the calm one, the man who never raised his voice or lost his composure. He looked like he had just seen a ghost. His face had gone grey, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold October air. They complied, though confusion was written clearly on every face. Hands dropped from weapons, bodies shifted backward. The aggressive posture of the tactical semicircle dissolved into uncertain retreat. Only Sloane stood his ground. "Sarge, what the hell are you doing?" His voice had gone high and reedy, a child's voice, the voice of someone who sensed that something had gone catastrophically wrong but couldn't understand what. "He's a suspect. He was resisting—" "Shut up, officer." Collins didn't even look at him. His eyes were fixed on the man on the bench, his body unconsciously straightening into something approaching attention. Collins walked the remaining steps forward, stopping directly in front of Marcus Washington, and then, with a formality that seemed utterly out of place in this suburban park on this ordinary morning, Sergeant William Collins executed a crisp textbook salute, the kind of salute you gave to visiting brass, the kind you gave at formal ceremonies and change of command events, the kind you gave to a superior officer. "Chief Washington," Collins said, his voice trembling. "Sir, I had no idea it was you." The silence that fell over the park was absolute. For a long moment, no one moved, no one spoke. Even the ducks had gone quiet, watching from their safe distance near the water. Marcus slowly lowered his hands from his head, resting them back on his lap. He looked at Collins with an expression that held both recognition and a deep, weary disappointment. "Hello, Sergeant Collins," he said, his voice carrying easily across the shocked assembly. "It has been a long time. You've put on a few stripes since the Metro days." "Yes, sir." Collins swallowed hard. "I transferred out here about 10 years ago." Marcus nodded slowly. "I retired here 5 years ago. Quiet town. Good place to feed ducks." Collins's face flushed with shame. The weight of what had almost happened, what had been seconds away from happening, settled onto his shoulders like a physical burden. "Sir, I'm so sorry. If I had known—" "It shouldn't matter if you knew me or not, William." The gentle interruption carried more weight than any shout could have. Collins flinched as though he had been slapped. Marcus rose slowly to his feet. It was a simple movement, but it seemed to transform him. The old man in worn clothing disappeared. In his place stood something else entirely, a figure of authority so absolute that even the officers who had never met him instinctively recognized it. He turned to face Officer Derek Sloane, and Sloane for the first time got a good look at the man he had been threatening. The name echoed in his increasingly panicked mind. Collins had called him Chief Washington. Chief! Not retired chief, not former chief, just chief. With the kind of reverence that didn't fade simply because someone had stopped wearing the badge. Washington. The name was familiar. Why was the name familiar? And then it hit him. A cold wave of terrible understanding crashing through the fog of his confusion. Marcus Washington was a legend. His name was taught in police academies across the state. His reforms had reshaped how entire departments approached use of force, bias training, accountability. He had testified before Congress, lectured at the FBI Academy, dismantled corrupt units that had operated with impunity for decades. He wasn't just a retired cop, he was police royalty. And Derek Sloane had just spent 20 minutes threatening him with a taser while lying to dispatch about his behavior. The taser slipped from Sloane's nerveless fingers, clattering against his leg before falling to the grass. His face had gone the color of old paper. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. "No," he whispered finally, the word barely audible. "No, no, no." Marcus watched the young officers collapse with an expression that held no satisfaction. He had seen this moment before. The instant when a bully realized they had finally picked the wrong victim. When the carefully constructed illusion of invincibility shattered against the reality of consequences. There was a poetry to it, certainly, a justice. But Marcus had been in law enforcement too long to take pleasure in another man's destruction, even a destruction that was entirely self-inflicted. "Sergeant Collins," Marcus said, turning back to the veteran officer, "I need you to secure Officer Sloane. He is to be placed on immediate administrative leave pending a formal investigation." Collins nodded, his face still pale. "Yes, sir. Consider it done. I also need all body camera footage from this encounter preserved. Officer Sloane's camera, the dash cam from his cruiser, and the cameras of every officer present. This footage is to be immediately sequestered and flagged for internal affairs review. Understood, sir." Additionally, Marcus continued, his voice carrying clearly to the recording devices on every officer's chest, "I am formally requesting that this incident be referred to the Federal Bureau of Investigation for potential civil rights violations under Title 18, Section 242. Officer Sloane approached me without probable cause, demanded identification without reasonable articulable suspicion, made false statements to dispatch describing me as hostile and aggressive when I was neither, physically assaulted me by grabbing my shoulder without justification, and threatened me with a weapon despite my complete compliance with his physical demands. Each accusation landed like a hammer blow. The other officers had frozen in place, the magnitude of the situation dawning on them. They had arrived expecting to back up a colleague handling a difficult suspect. Instead, they were witnesses to the documentation of that colleague's career-ending misconduct. Sloane made a sound somewhere between a moan and a whimper. His legs seemed to give out beneath him, and he sank to his knees on the frost-kissed grass, staring blankly at nothing. "You can't do this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was just doing my job." Marcus took a step closer, looking down at the kneeling officer with something that might have been pity. "Your job," he said quietly, "is to protect and serve the community. Your job is to uphold the Constitution of the United States. What you did today was bring your own prejudice and your own unchecked ego into a uniform that thousands of good men and women have died wearing." He paused, letting the words sink in. "You are a disgrace to that badge, son." Another pause. "And you are going to answer for what you've done." The next few minutes passed in a kind of controlled chaos, Collins snapping into action with the efficiency of a man who understood that his own career now depended on handling this situation correctly, moved to secure Sloane. He ordered the young officer to his feet, turned him around, and placed him in handcuffs. The same handcuffs Sloane had intended to use on Marcus. The metallic click echoed across the silent lake, a punctuation mark to a career that had just ended. "Officer Sloane, you are being detained pending an administrative investigation," Collins said, his voice flat and professional. "You will be transported to the station and processed. You have the right to union representation during any questioning." Sloane said nothing. The fight had gone out of him entirely, replaced by a kind of shocked emptiness that Marcus recognized from other officers he had seen face the consequences of their actions. Badge, duty belt, service weapon. Each item was stripped away with a formality that carried its own kind of weight. The symbols of authority that Sloane had weaponized were now being taken from him, one by one. Dorothy Pemberton had lowered her phone but hadn't stopped recording. Tears were streaming down her face. Not for Sloane, but from the sheer emotional relief of what hadn't happened. She had watched Marcus nearly become another statistic, another name, another tragedy. And she had watched justice arrive just in time to prevent it. "Chief Washington?" she called out, her voice shaky. "Are you all right?" Marcus turned toward her, his expression softening slightly. "I'm fine, Dorothy. Thank you for staying. Thank you for recording. I didn't know what else to do. What you did may have saved my life," Marcus said simply, "and it will certainly help ensure that what happened here today cannot be swept under the rug." The other officers had gathered in a loose cluster near their vehicles, speaking in low voices that carried the weight of shock and worry. Marcus could read their body language easily, the sideways glances, the nervous energy, the dawning realization that they had nearly been complicit in something terrible. Collins approached Marcus, his posture still deferential, his face still pale. "Sir, if you'd like to make a formal statement now, I can take it personally. Or if you prefer to come to the station, we can arrange private transportation." Marcus shook his head slowly. "I'll come to the station later today, Sergeant. Right now, I need you to understand something." He stepped closer, lowering his voice so that only Collins could hear. "This isn't about me, William. If I'd been just some old man feeding ducks, if I hadn't been Chief Washington, if I hadn't had the training and the knowledge and the connections, I could be dead right now, or at minimum I would be sitting in your holding cell, charged with crimes I didn't commit, based on lies Officer Sloane told over the radio." Collins's face crumpled slightly. "I know, sir. The only difference between me and that hypothetical old man is that I had power," Marcus continued. "I had a name that made your officers stop before you went any further. But power like that shouldn't be necessary. The law should protect everyone equally, regardless of who they know or what position they used to hold." "I understand, sir." "Do you?" Marcus's eyes were piercing. "Because I need you to understand this deeply, Sergeant. Officer Sloane didn't become a problem today. He has been a problem for years, I'm certain of it. Men like him don't wake up one morning and suddenly decide to profile an elderly man in a park. This is a pattern. This is behavior that was allowed to continue, perhaps even enabled by a department that looked the other way because it was easier than confronting it." Collins swallowed hard but didn't deny it. "Find the pattern," Marcus said. "Dig into his history. Find the other complaints, the other incidents, the other victims who didn't have the name or the power to fight back. And make sure that what happened today becomes the catalyst for actual change, not just a media story that fades away in a week." "Yes, sir," Collins said. "I will." Marcus nodded slowly, then turned to look back at the bench where this had all begun. His canvas bag of birdseed lay scattered on the grass. The ducks had retreated to the far side of the lake, watching from a safe distance. "Now," he said quietly, almost to himself, "I believe I was feeding birds." 2 hours later, Marcus Washington sat in the modest living room of his home in Oakwood Hills. The house was small by the standards of the neighborhood. 3 bedrooms, a single-car garage, a backyard that backed up to protected woodland. He had bought it specifically because it didn't look like the home of a man who had once commanded thousands. He had wanted anonymity, simplicity, peace. So much for peace. He sat in his worn leather armchair, The same armchair he had read in every evening since retirement, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold in his hands, his field jacket hung by the door. And he had changed into comfortable clothes, an old sweatshirt from his alma mater, faded jeans, worn slippers. But his mind was not at rest. The phone on the side table had been ringing intermittently for the past hour. Word had spread through the law enforcement community with the speed of wildfire. Former Chief Washington, detained in a suburban park, threatened with a taser by some rookie with an attitude problem. The calls were coming from old colleagues, former subordinates, retired officers who had served under his command and wanted to express their outrage. Marcus had let most of the calls go to voicemail. He needed time to think. The incident in the park had shaken something loose inside him, something he had tried to bury when he retired. The anger, the frustration, the bone-deep weariness of spending a lifetime fighting battles that seemed to regenerate no matter how many times you won them. He had thought he was done. He had thought that his years of reform, his policies, his training programs, his relentless pressure for accountability, he had thought all of that had made a difference. And in many ways it had. The department he had led was measurably better than it had been when he took command. Officers were better trained, better supervised, better held to account. But Officer Derek Sloane wasn't from his department. Sloane was from somewhere else, some other jurisdiction that had apparently allowed him to develop his pattern of behavior unchecked. And when that department had finally grown tired of the complaints and the liability, they hadn't fired him. They hadn't decertified him, they had simply transferred him somewhere else, where he could continue doing what he had always done. Marcus had encountered this pattern throughout his career. Gypsy cops, some people called them, officers who bounced from department to department, one step ahead of the consequences of their actions. The law enforcement community, for all its professed commitment to integrity, was remarkably good at protecting its own from accountability, and that pattern had almost killed him this morning. A knock at the door pulled Marcus from his thoughts. He rose slowly, his joints protesting the movement after sitting for so long, and made his way to the entrance. Through the peephole, he saw exactly who he expected to see. Robert Hartley, chief of the Oakwood Hills Police Department. Looking profoundly uncomfortable in his dress uniform, Marcus opened the door. "Chief Washington," Hartley said, his voice carrying the practiced tone of a man who had spent his career navigating political situations. "Sir, I'm so deeply sorry about what happened this morning. I want to personally apologize on behalf of the entire department, and I want to assure you that Officer Sloane will be dealt with to the fullest extent of our administrative policies." Marcus studied the man for a long moment. Hartley was 53, a career administrator who had risen through the ranks more on his political skills than his policing abilities. He was the kind of chief who looked good at press conferences and community events, but preferred to delegate the difficult work to his subordinates. Marcus had known many such chiefs during his career, men who saw the position as a capstone rather than a responsibility. "Come in, Robert," Marcus said finally, stepping aside. Hartley entered, his eyes moving nervously around the modest living room. The walls were covered with framed commendations, photographs with governors and senators, newspaper clippings of major cases, the evidence of a career that made his own look small by comparison. "Please sit," Marcus said, gesturing toward the couch. Hartley sat on the edge of the cushions, his posture tense and uncomfortable. "Sir, I want you to know that Officer Sloane has been placed on immediate administrative leave. We are launching a full investigation, and I can assure you." "What is Officer Sloane's history?" Marcus interrupted quietly. Hartley blinked. "His history? Before he came to your department, what do you know about his record?" The pause that followed told Marcus everything he needed to know. "He transferred from the metropolitan area," Hartley said slowly. "There were some personality conflicts at his previous assignment. The transfer was presented as an opportunity for a fresh start." "Personality conflicts." Marcus let the euphemism hang in the air. "Did you request his full personnel file before accepting his transfer?" Another pause. "Longer this time. The file we received indicated that he had passed all performance benchmarks." "That's not what I asked." Marcus's voice remained quiet, but something in it made Hartley flinch. "Did you request his full file? Including his complaint history, his use of force reports, any internal affairs investigations?" Hartley couldn't meet his eyes. "Chief Washington, you know how these transfers work. Departments are often reluctant to share certain information." "I know exactly how transfers work, Robert." Marcus leaned forward in his chair. "I also know that a 30-second phone call to his previous supervisor would have revealed that Derek Sloane had 5 excessive force complaints in 6 years. 5 complaints, Robert, all involving minorities, all dismissed for insufficient evidence." Hartley's face had gone pale. "I spent this morning making some calls to old colleagues," Marcus continued, "and I learned some very disturbing things about the man you hired to protect this community. Would you like to know what I found?" Hartley looked like he would rather be anywhere else in the world. "Victim number 1, Marcus said, pulling a small notepad from his pocket. He had been taking notes all morning, building the case the way he had built hundreds of cases during his career. James Patterson, 45 years old, Latino, business owner, stopped by Officer Sloane 2 years ago for an alleged broken taillight. Sloane demanded to search the vehicle. When Patterson refused and asked for a supervisor, Sloane called for backup and conducted the search anyway, claiming he smelled marijuana. He didn't find anything, Robert. Nothing. But he made James Patterson stand on the side of the road in front of his 2 young sons for 45 minutes while he tore their car apart. Marcus flipped to the next page. Victim number 2, Keisha Robinson, 23 years old, nursing student. Pulled over for allegedly running a stop sign. Body camera footage, which I obtained this morning through some favors, shows she came to a complete stop. Sloane demanded she exit the vehicle, told her she was acting suspicious, called her a liar when she said she hadn't run the sign. He let her go eventually, but not before she had a panic attack on the side of the road. Another page. Victim number 3, Marcus Williams. Yes, he shares my first name, which is a coincidence that doesn't escape me. 17 years old, high school junior, walking home from basketball practice through what Sloane apparently considered the wrong neighborhood. Sloane stopped him, demanded ID, claimed the boy matched the description of a robbery suspect. When Marcus asked what description, Sloane grabbed him, threw him to the ground, and held him face down on hot asphalt for 12 minutes while backup arrived. The boy had abrasions on his face and chest. The robbery suspect they were looking for turned out to be 5'6". Marcus Williams is 6'3". Marcus closed the notepad. I have 2 more, he said quietly. Similar patterns, similar victims, all minorities, all stopped for reasons that turned out to be fabricated or trivial. All subjected to treatment that crossed the line from law enforcement into harassment and assault. Hartley had gone from pale to almost grey. 5 complaints, Robert. 5 complaints that you apparently didn't know about because you didn't bother to look. And those are just the ones that were formally filed. How many others didn't complain because they didn't think anyone would listen? How many others are out there right now carrying the trauma of an encounter with an officer your department hired without proper vetting? Hartley's voice came out as a croak. He cleared his throat and tried again. I don't know what to say, sir. This is devastating. What it is, Marcus said, is a lawsuit waiting to happen. Multiple lawsuits. And given that this morning's incident is already spreading across social media, thanks to a witness who recorded the entire thing, those lawsuits are going to come with national media attention. Hartley's face somehow managed to go even paler. But that's not what concerns me most, Marcus continued. What concerns me most is that nothing I'm telling you is unique to Derek Sloane or the Oakwood Hills Police Department. This happens everywhere, Robert. Officers with documented histories of misconduct get shuffled from department to department because no one wants to deal with the hassle of actually holding them accountable. And eventually one of those officers does something that can't be ignored. Shoots someone, beats someone on camera, targets someone who happens to have power and connections. He stood up, walking to the window that looked out over his quiet backyard. You want to know what I want? Marcus asked, his voice thoughtful now rather than angry. I don't want a quiet settlement. I don't want a hushed resignation that allows Derek Sloane to move to another department 2 counties over and do this to someone else. I want him made an example of. I want the footage released. I want the public to see exactly what happened this morning and exactly what led to it. Chief Washington, if we release that footage, the media coverage will be extensive. I know. Marcus turned back to face Hartley. That's the point. The public needs to see what the system allows to happen. They need to see how officers like Sloane develop their patterns, how they're protected and enabled, how they're passed from department to department until they finally encounter someone who can fight back. He walked closer to Hartley, his presence suddenly commanding despite his casual clothes and comfortable surroundings. You have a choice to make, Robert. You can try to minimize this, manage the PR, hope it blows over, or you can use this as an opportunity to examine your own department, your own hiring practices, your own accountability structures. You can become the chief who turned a scandal into reform. Hartley looked up at Marcus with something approaching desperation. What do you want me to do? Fire Officer Sloane today, not administrative leave, termination. Then announce that you're opening a review of all transfers into your department over the past 5 years, specifically examining complaint histories that may not have been properly communicated. Announce that you're implementing the training programs on bias and de-escalation that should have been implemented years ago. And cooperate fully with the federal investigation that will be coming. Federal investigation? I have already spoken with contacts at the Department of Justice, Marcus said calmly. Given the severity of the civil rights violations documented on camera this morning, they are very interested in taking a closer look at how Derek Sloane was able to develop his pattern of behavior unchecked and how he was able to transfer between departments without that pattern being addressed. Hartley looked like a man who had just watched his career flash before his eyes. You can be on the right side of this, Robert, Marcus said, his voice softening slightly. Or you can try to protect yourself and your department, in which case you will become part of the story rather than part of the solution. The choice is yours. The video went live that evening. Dorothy Pemberton, after consulting with Marcus and receiving his blessing, posted the footage to her social media accounts with a simple caption, "This morning in Riverside Park. An elderly man feeding ducks. Watch what happens." Within hours, the video had been shared thousands of times. By midnight, it was on every major news network. The footage was damning in its clarity. There was no ambiguity, no room for alternative interpretation. The video showed Marcus sitting peacefully on the bench, tossing corn to the ducks. It showed Officer Sloane approaching with aggressive body language, his hand on his weapon. It showed the escalating confrontation, Sloane's increasingly hostile demands, Marcus's calm responses, the moment when Sloane grabbed Marcus's shoulder, and then, with devastating audio clarity, it captured Sloane's radio call to dispatch, non-compliant, aggressive male, refusing lawful orders, physically resisting. The viewer could see with their own eyes that none of these descriptions were true. Marcus was seated, calm, his hands visible. He wasn't resisting because there was nothing to resist. He wasn't aggressive because he hadn't raised his voice or made any threatening gesture. Sloane had lied, on camera, in real time. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Civil rights organizations issued statements condemning the incident and demanding accountability. Legal experts appeared on cable news to analyze the encounter, pointing out each constitutional violation, each departmental policy breach, each moment where Sloane had crossed the line from aggressive policing into criminal behavior. When the news broke that the victim of this harassment was not merely an elderly man feeding ducks, but retired Chief of Police Marcus Washington, a legend in law enforcement, a reformer who had dedicated his career to preventing exactly this kind of misconduct, the story exploded beyond even Marcus's expectations. The irony was too perfect for the media to resist. Here was a man who had spent his life trying to fix the problems in policing, who had trained thousands of officers, who had literally written the policies that governed how police should interact with civilians, and he had been subjected to the exact abuse he had fought against. If it could happen to him, the commentary pieces asked, what chance did ordinary citizens have? Sloane, reached for comment by a reporter who had somehow gotten his phone number, had nothing coherent to say. His voice, captured on a recording that also went viral, was barely recognizable. The confident bully replaced by a stammering, panicked man who kept repeating that he hadn't known, that it was a misunderstanding, that he was just doing his job. The phrase "just doing my job" became a meme within hours, used sarcastically in thousands of posts and comments. By the next morning, the Oakwood Hills Police Department had received so many angry calls that their phone system crashed. Chief Hartley held a press conference in which he announced, looking like a man facing a firing squad, that Officer Derek Sloane had been terminated and that a full review of departmental hiring practices was underway. It was, Marcus noted grimly, exactly what he had asked for. But it wasn't enough. It was never enough. Because Derek Sloane was one man, and the problems that had created him were embedded in institutions and cultures and assumptions that couldn't be changed by firing a single officer. Still, it was a start. The federal arrest warrant came down 4 days after the incident in the park. Marcus learned about it from a phone call. An old friend at the FBI's Civil Rights Division who had been involved in drafting the charges. The call came at 6:47 in the morning, while Marcus was drinking his first cup of coffee and watching the ducks gather near the shore of the lake through his kitchen window. "We're executing the warrant in about an hour," his friend said. "Thought you'd want to know. What are the charges?" "Deprivation of rights under color of law. That's the main one. Title 18, Section 242. We're also adding filing a false police report, official misconduct, and assault. The video makes it an open and shut case, Marcus. Any jury that sees that footage is going to convict." Marcus nodded, though his friend couldn't see it. "What about the previous victims, the ones from before he came to Oakwood Hills?" "We're looking into it. If we can establish a pattern, and it sounds like we can, we may be able to file additional charges. At minimum, they'll have civil cases that are now much stronger given what happened to you." "Good." Marcus paused. "Make sure they know, would you?" "James Patterson, the Williams family, the others. Make sure they know that what happened to them is finally being taken seriously. I'll see to it personally." The line went dead, and Marcus set down his phone. He should have felt satisfaction, perhaps, vindication. The system, for all its failures, was working. A bad cop was going to face real consequences. But all he felt was tired. Tired and old, and profoundly aware that this one case, however satisfying its resolution, was a drop in an ocean of similar cases that would never be addressed. For every Derek Sloane who got caught on camera and brought to justice, how many others continued their patterns in the shadows? Marcus finished his coffee, put on his old field jacket, and walked down to the park to feed the ducks. The sun was just coming up over the lake, painting the water in shades of gold and amber. The mallards gathered eagerly at his approach, Reynolds pushing to the front as always, Patterson hanging back until there was room. Marcus sat on his bench, with the wrought iron frame and the view of the water, and began tossing corn. A few other morning visitors nodded to him as they passed. Some recognized him now from the news coverage. They smiled with something like solidarity, like shared understanding. Marcus smiled back, though the expression didn't quite reach his eyes. The ducks didn't know anything about the news coverage. They didn't know about the arrests or the investigations or the civil rights implications. They just knew that the man on the bench had corn, and they were hungry. There was something comforting in that simplicity. The investigation into Derek Sloane's background revealed exactly what Marcus had expected to find. FBI agents, working in coordination with internal affairs units from multiple departments, uncovered a trail of misconduct that stretched back to Sloane's first year on the job. Not 5 complaints. That had been the official count. The incidents that had been formally documented. The real number, when investigators began reaching out to community members who had encountered Sloane, was closer to 20. 20 separate incidents of harassment, intimidation, and abuse. 20 people who had been stopped for no valid reason, questioned, searched, detained, humiliated. 20 people who had looked at the complaint process and decided it wasn't worth the trouble, because they had seen how such complaints ended, had heard from friends and family members who had tried to hold officers accountable and been ignored. The pattern was undeniable. Sloane's targets were almost exclusively minorities, Black, Latino, a few Asian Americans. They were stopped in affluent neighborhoods for not belonging, in their own neighborhoods for acting suspicious, on highways for infractions that didn't exist. The pretext varied, but the underlying behavior was consistent. Aggressive approaches, demands for compliance, escalation when that compliance wasn't immediate and total. What was most damning wasn't what Sloane had done, but what the system had allowed. His first department had received 3 complaints in 2 years. Rather than take disciplinary action, they had simply encouraged Sloane to apply for a lateral transfer to get him off their hands. The receiving department, a suburban force similar to Oakwood Hills, had been happy to accept a young, enthusiastic officer without asking too many questions. That department had received 2 more complaints before also deciding that a quiet transfer was easier than a formal review. They had sent Sloane to Oakwood Hills with a letter of recommendation that praised his proactive policing style. 3 departments, 7 years, a trail of traumatized citizens left in his wake. And at every step, the system had protected him. The media coverage of the investigation was extensive and brutal. Op-eds appeared in major newspapers using Sloane as a case study for everything wrong with police accountability in America. Civil rights organizations held press conferences demanding reform of the transfer processes that allowed problem officers to escape consequences. Politicians who had built careers on being tough on crime found themselves facing uncomfortable questions about what, exactly, being tough on crime meant when the criminals were wearing badges. And through it all, Marcus Washington found himself thrust back into a spotlight he had thought he had left behind. Interview requests poured in. National news programs, podcasts, documentary filmmakers. Speaking invitations arrived from police academies, civil rights organizations, congressional committees. Everyone wanted to hear from the man who had nearly become a victim of the system he had spent his life trying to reform. Marcus accepted some of the invitations, refused others. He was selective about which platforms he used, which messages he wanted to amplify. Because he understood that this moment was rare. That the confluence of viral video, sympathetic victim, and clear villain had created an opportunity for genuine conversation about policing in America. Such moments didn't come often, and they didn't last long. If he was going to spend his remaining years pushing for the changes he had always believed in, he needed to be strategic about how he used his voice. And so, at 68 years old, Marcus Washington came out of retirement, not to command a department. Those days were behind him. But to bear witness, to speak truth, to remind everyone who would listen that what had happened to him was not unusual, was not an isolated incident, was not the result of one bad apple in an otherwise healthy barrel. The barrel itself was rotten, and it was long past time to rebuild it from the ground up. The trial of Derek Sloane began on a grey February morning, 6 months after the incident in Riverside Park. The federal courthouse in the state capital was surrounded by media, cameras, reporters, satellite trucks stretching down the block. This case had become a referendum on policing in America, and everyone wanted to witness its conclusion. Marcus arrived early, dressed in a dark suit, his bearing as commanding as it had been during his years in uniform. He walked past the cameras without comment, ignoring the shouted questions, his eyes fixed straight ahead. Inside, the courtroom was packed to capacity. Journalists occupied every available seat, sketch artists positioned to capture the proceedings, representatives from civil rights organizations watching intently from the gallery. Derek Sloane sat at the defense table, looking nothing like the aggressive officer who had threatened Marcus with a taser. 6 months in county jail awaiting trial had stripped 40 pounds from his frame. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, his expensive civilian clothes hanging loosely on his diminished body. His defense attorney was a former federal prosecutor who had built a reputation on getting good results for difficult clients. She had tried every tactic available. Motions to suppress evidence, arguments about jurisdiction, claims of selective prosecution, all had been denied. The video was simply too clear. The lies too documented. The violations too obvious. The prosecution's case was surgical in its precision. They showed the footage frame by frame, highlighting each violation. They played the radio transmission where Sloane described Marcus as non-compliant, aggressive, hostile, accusations that the video proved were entirely fabricated. They called Marcus to the stand. He sat in the witness chair with the same calm he had maintained on that park bench. Answering questions in his deep, measured voice, he described the encounter from his perspective, the approach, the demands, the escalation, the moment when Sloane's hand clamped down on his shoulder. "What were you thinking in that moment?" the prosecutor asked. Marcus was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I was thinking that I might die," he said. "I was thinking that a man who had lied to dispatch, who had described me as aggressive when I was sitting still, who had grabbed me without justification. That man was now calling for backup that would arrive expecting violence. I was thinking about all the cases I had reviewed during my career, where innocent people were killed because of exactly this kind of escalation. Did you resist Officer Sloane in any way?" "No. I knew that resistance, however justified, could be fatal. So I kept my hands visible. I kept my voice calm. I complied with his physical demands even though those demands were unlawful." "Why did you comply if you knew the demands were unlawful?" Marcus looked directly at Sloane across the courtroom. "Because I wanted to live," he said simply. "Because I wanted to see tomorrow. Because I was not going to let a man like him be the one to end my story." The defense's cross-examination was vigorous but ultimately futile. The attorney tried to suggest that Marcus had been uncooperative, that his refusal to produce identification had escalated the situation. Marcus calmly cited the relevant case law, explained the constitutional limits on police authority, demonstrated with devastating clarity that he had done nothing wrong. By the time the defense rested, everyone in the courtroom knew how this was going to end. But the prosecution wasn't finished. Over the next 3 days, they called a parade of witnesses, the other victims of Derek Sloane's pattern of misconduct. One by one, they took the stand and told their stories. James Patterson, the Latino business owner, described being searched in front of his children. His voice broke as he recounted his 7-year-old son asking, "Daddy, why is the policeman being mean to you?" Keisha Robinson, the nursing student, described the panic attack she had suffered on the side of the road, the weeks of anxiety that followed, the fear of driving that still gripped her years later. Marcus Williams, now 19 and a college freshman, described being thrown to the ground on hot asphalt while walking home from basketball practice. He showed the jury the scars on his face, faded now, but still visible. Each story was different in its details, but the pattern was unmistakable. Sloane had targeted minorities, he had fabricated justifications, he had escalated encounters that should never have happened, and at every step the system had protected him. The defense objected repeatedly, arguing that the prior incidents were prejudicial, that the prosecution was trying to inflame the jury. The judge overruled most of the objections. The pattern evidence was directly relevant to the charges. It showed that Sloane's behavior toward Marcus was not an aberration, but a practice. By the time the final victim finished testifying, several members of the jury were visibly moved. One woman in the front row was wiping tears from her eyes. The defense's closing argument was competent but desperate. The attorney argued that Sloane had made mistakes, that he had been poorly trained, that he was a product of a system that had failed him. She asked for mercy, for understanding, for a recognition that police officers operated in difficult circumstances that civilians couldn't fully appreciate. The prosecution's closing was devastating. Officer Sloane had every advantage, the prosecutor said, standing before the jury. He had the badge, the gun, the authority of the state. He had training. He had supervision. He had colleagues. And what did he do with all of those advantages? He used them to harass, intimidate, and brutalize citizens who had done nothing wrong. She pointed at Sloane. He looked at Marcus Washington, a man who spent 38 years in law enforcement, who dedicated his life to making policing better. And he saw a vagrant, a criminal, a threat, not because of anything Mr. Washington did, but because of what Mr. Washington looked like. That's not policing. That's prejudice with a badge. And it has to stop. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Has the jury reached a verdict? We have, Your Honor. The courtroom fell absolutely silent as the foreperson rose. Marcus sat in the gallery, his hands folded in his lap, his face revealing nothing. On the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law, how does the jury find? We find the defendant guilty. A murmur ran through the courtroom. The judge called for order. On the charge of filing a false police report, how does the jury find? We find the defendant guilty. On the charge of official misconduct, how does the jury find? We find the defendant guilty. On the charge of assault under color of law, how does the jury find? We find the defendant guilty. Derek Sloane slumped in his chair, his head dropping into his hands. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, a futile gesture of comfort. The judge thanked the jury for their service and announced that sentencing would take place in 6 weeks. She remanded Sloane to custody pending that hearing. As the officers approached to take Sloane away, Marcus watched without expression. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction. He felt only the weight of all the cases that would never see this kind of resolution. The victims who didn't have video evidence, who didn't have prominent identities, who couldn't command the attention of federal prosecutors. This was justice for Marcus Washington. But it was a rare exception in a system that usually worked very differently. The sentencing hearing drew an even larger crowd than the trial itself. The courthouse steps were lined with protesters on both sides, some demanding maximum punishment for Sloane, others holding signs claiming he had been railroaded by a politically motivated prosecution. News helicopters circled overhead, their cameras feeding live coverage to networks across the country. Inside, the atmosphere was more subdued but no less charged. The prosecution argued for the maximum sentence, citing the pattern of misconduct, the lack of remorse, The damage done to public trust in law enforcement. They presented impact statements from Sloane's victims, each one a testament to the lasting harm his actions had caused. The defense pleaded for leniency. They argued that Sloane had been poorly trained, that he had been trying to do his job in the way he thought he was supposed to, that his career and his life were already destroyed. Then the judge invited Marcus Washington to speak. Marcus rose slowly, walked to the podium, and faced the bench. He had thought long and hard about what he wanted to say, had written and rewritten his statement, had prayed for the wisdom to find the right words. "Your Honor," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "I have spent my life in law enforcement. I have seen the best of what this profession can be, and I have seen the worst. I have worked alongside officers of tremendous courage and integrity, and I have had to remove officers who betrayed everything the badge represents." He paused, gathering himself. Derek Sloane is not an anomaly. He is the product of a system I spent decades trying to change. He learned his behavior somewhere. He was enabled by supervisors who looked the other way. He was protected by departments that passed him along rather than confronting the problem he represented. That does not excuse what he did. It does not lessen his responsibility for the choices he made. But it does mean that punishing him alone will not solve the problem. The system that created him is still operating, still producing officers who believe that power is more important than justice, that authority is more important than service. Marcus turned to look at Sloane. "What you did to me was wrong. But more importantly, what you did to James Patterson was wrong. What you did to Marcus Williams was wrong. What you did to all the people who were too afraid or too cynical to report your behavior, that was wrong too. You have destroyed your career, you have destroyed your reputation. You are about to spend years in federal prison. I do not wish additional suffering upon you. But I do hope that somewhere, somehow you come to understand why what you did was evil. I hope you understand that the people you brutalized were human beings with families and dreams and the same right to dignity that you claim for yourself. I hope that understanding haunts you for the rest of your days." He turned back to the judge. "I ask only that whatever sentence you impose sends a clear message, not just to Officer Sloane, but to every officer who has ever used the badge as a weapon. There must be consequences, there must be accountability, there must be justice." Marcus returned to his seat. The courtroom was absolutely still. Judge Margaret Chen took a long moment before speaking. She was known as a measured jurist, someone who rarely showed emotion from the bench. But there was something different in her expression today. A weight, a gravity that seemed to press down on her shoulders. "Mr. Sloane," she said finally, "please rise." Derek Sloane stood on shaking legs, his attorney beside him. "I have presided over many cases involving law enforcement misconduct," the judge continued. "Each one is tragic in its own way. Tragic for the victims. Tragic for the communities that lose trust in those sworn to protect them. And tragic for the officers whose choices lead them to stand before this court. But this case is different. This case involves a victim who dedicated his entire life to making law enforcement better. A man who trained thousands of officers, who implemented reforms, who quite literally wrote the policies that govern how police should interact with civilians. And you, Mr. Sloane, treated him as a criminal. You treated him as a threat, not because of anything he did, but because of assumptions you made based on the color of his skin and the clothes he was wearing. That is not policing. That is predation." She paused, consulting her notes. "I have considered the arguments for leniency. I have considered your youth, your lack of criminal history, the failures of the systems that should have intervened before you reached this point. But I cannot ignore the pattern of your conduct. I cannot ignore the multiple victims who came forward to testify about their experiences with you. I cannot ignore the fundamental betrayal of public trust that your actions represent." She looked directly at Sloane. "Derek Sloane, for the crimes of which you have been convicted, I sentence you to 4 years in federal prison." A gasp ran through the courtroom. "Following your release, you will serve 3 years of supervised probation. You are permanently barred from employment in any law enforcement capacity. Your name will be added to the National Decertification Index, ensuring that no police department anywhere in this country can ever hire you again. Additionally, I am recommending that the Department of Justice expand its investigation to include the departments that employed you prior to Oakwood Hills, specifically to examine how you were able to accumulate such a documented pattern of misconduct without facing meaningful consequences." She banged her gavel. "This court is adjourned." Derek Sloane was led away in handcuffs. He didn't look back. The aftermath of the trial extended far beyond the conviction of one officer. The media coverage had opened a national conversation about the gypsy cop problem, officers who bounced from department to department, one step ahead of accountability. State legislatures began introducing bills to require comprehensive background checks for all police transfers, to mandate the sharing of complaint histories between departments, to create centralized databases that would track officer misconduct regardless of where it occurred. Some bills passed. Others were blocked by police unions and their political allies. The battle for reform, as Marcus had always known, would be fought one increment at a time. The Department of Justice expanded its investigation, just as the judge had recommended. 2 more departments, the ones that had employed Sloane before Oakwood Hills, found themselves subject to consent decrees, forced to implement reforms they had resisted for years. Civil lawsuits filed by Sloane's previous victims finally began to move forward, with the criminal conviction on the record. With the pattern evidence established, settlements were reached. James Patterson received compensation for his humiliation. Marcus Williams received recognition that what had happened to him was wrong. It wasn't enough. It could never be enough to undo the harm that had been done. But it was something. The Oakwood Hills Police Department emerged from the consent decree process transformed. Chief Hartley had resigned rather than face the scrutiny of reform, replaced by a new chief, a woman named Sandra Davis, who had reached out to Marcus during the selection process, who had asked for his guidance in building something better. Marcus had given her what advice he could. The problem isn't individual officers, he told her. The problem is culture. The problem is the 1,000 small decisions that add up to a department that protects its own rather than serving its community. Change the culture and you change everything. Fail to change the culture and nothing else matters. Sandra Davis listened, and she tried. Marcus Washington filed a civil lawsuit against the Oakwood Hills Police Department and the municipality that governed it. The case was straightforward. The evidence was undeniable. The violations were documented on camera. The defendant's own employee had been convicted of federal crimes. The city's lawyers recommended an immediate settlement rather than risk the damages that a jury might award. The settlement amount was $2.4 million. Marcus didn't keep a single dollar. He established a legal defense fund, the Thomas Washington Memorial Fund, named after his father, dedicated to providing free legal representation to individuals who had been wrongfully targeted by law enforcement. The fund would cover attorneys' fees, expert witnesses, investigation costs, and all the other expenses that usually made seeking justice impossible for those who could least afford it. At the press conference announcing the fund, Marcus explained his decision. "I survived what happened to me because I had power," he said. "I had a name that made my attacker stop before he went any further. I had connections that brought attention to my case. I had resources to ensure that justice was served. Most people don't have any of those things. They face the same treatment I faced, but without any of the advantages I had. They are ground up by a system that protects officers over citizens, that dismisses complaints for insufficient evidence, that looks the other way when the victims are poor or marginalized or simply too exhausted to keep fighting. This money belongs to them." The fund received additional donations within hours of the announcement. Civil rights organizations, private citizens, foundations dedicated to justice reform. The contributions poured in, quickly tripling the original amount. It was, Marcus reflected, perhaps the most meaningful accomplishment of his career. 1 year after the incident in the park, autumn returned to Riverside. The air was crisp, the trees ablaze with color. The lake mirror still beneath the golden morning light. The ducks had returned from wherever ducks went during the summer months, gathering near the shore in anticipation of their regular visitor. Marcus Washington walked the familiar path from his home, his old field jacket buttoned against the chill, a canvas bag of cracked corn in his weathered hands. His step was perhaps a bit slower than it had been a year ago. The trial had taken something out of him. The endless interviews and speaking engagements and meetings with legislators who wanted his endorsement. He was tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix, but he was also, in some strange way, at peace. He reached the wrought iron bench by the water's edge and paused. Something new had been added since his last visit. A bronze plaque bolted to the backrest, gleaming in the morning light. He leaned closer to read the inscription, dedicated to justice, dignity, and the truth that rights belong to everyone. In honor of Chief Marcus Washington, who reminded us that power means nothing without accountability. Marcus stood there for a long moment, his fingers tracing the engraved letters. The city council had approved the plaque as part of their settlement, a permanent reminder of what had happened here, and what had changed because of it. He wasn't sure how he felt about it. The plaque seemed to transform the park bench into something it had never been before. A monument, a symbol, a place where tourists might come to take photographs. He had liked it better when it was just a bench, just a quiet spot to feed the ducks and escape the noise of the world. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps there were no truly quiet spots anymore. No places where a black man could simply exist without carrying the weight of history and injustice and the endless struggle for something better. He sat down anyway. The ducks gathered eagerly at his approach, Reynolds pushing to the front as always, Patterson hanging back until there was room. Marcus began tossing corn, settling into the familiar rhythm, letting the simple act quiet his thoughts. A patrol car rolled past on the gravel path, slowing as it approached the bench. Marcus tensed for a moment. Old reflexes, old fears, but the officer behind the wheel simply offered a respectful nod through the open window. The officer was young, black, recently graduated from the department's reform training program. Marcus had spoken to her class a few months ago, had told them about what had happened in this park, had challenged them to be the officers their communities needed them to be. "Morning, Chief," she called out. "Beautiful day for it." "Morning, officer. Stay safe out there." "Yes, sir. You too." The cruiser continued on its patrol, disappearing around the bend in the path. Marcus watched it go, then turned back to the ducks. Reynolds had managed to claim a disproportionate share of the corn, as usual. Some things, it seemed, never changed, but other things did. The training programs Marcus had developed were now mandatory across the state. The gypsy cop loopholes were slowly being closed. The oversight mechanisms he had long advocated for were finally being implemented. Change was happening. Not as fast as he wanted, not as complete as he hoped, but happening nonetheless. And sitting here, on this quiet bench by this peaceful lake, Marcus allowed himself to believe that it mattered, that all the years of fighting, all the battles won and lost, all the compromises and setbacks and small victories, that it had made some kind of difference. He wasn't naive. He knew that the problems he had spent his life fighting were bigger than any one man could solve. He knew that somewhere right now some other officer was stopping some other citizen for no valid reason, was escalating a situation that didn't need to escalate, was treating the badge as a weapon rather than a trust. But he also knew that change was possible. He had seen it happen, he had helped make it happen, and tomorrow he would get up and do what he could do. He would make phone calls and give speeches and mentor young officers who wanted to be better than the ones who had come before. He would fight the fights that needed fighting, for as long as he had the strength to fight them. But today, right now, in this moment, he was just an old man feeding ducks, and that he thought was enough. If this story moved you, if it made you think about justice and accountability and the long struggle for change, please subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more stories like this one. Stories that matter. Stories that challenge. Stories that remind us all that progress is possible when good people refuse to look away.